Hello and welcome back to this little island amid the ocean that YouTube is. As I mentioned on my previous video regarding the Ainu, Japan is often perceived as a cohesive ethnic group, in which its predominant ethnic group is the Yamato or Wajin. The term Yamato marks social and cultural differences from other ethnic groups, and the concept of pure blood as criteria for the uniqueness of the Yamato would begin to spread in Japan around 1880, in which was initially used to justify the conquest of Asia. We've spoke of the Ainu on my previous video, which you can find linked in the description, and today we'll look at those still fighting to be recognized as an indigenous group, the Okinawans or Ryukyu. The Ryukyans or Okinawans live on the southernmost islands of Japan, more precisely in the Ryukyu Islands, that were annexed by Japan and established as Okinawa Prefecture 1879. During the World War II, Okinawa was placed under the United States administration for 27 years, in which from 1950s until 1972, they had an indigenous government, albeit under the US. Then, in 1972, the Ryukyu Islands would be returned to Japan. Sharing the same Paleolithic and Jomon cultures as Japan, Ryukyu culture was deeply influenced by China and Asian empires, with which they traded throughout the centuries. Ryukyan history can thus be divided into four periods: the Old Stone Age, the Jomon period, the Guzuku period or Aji period, and the Sazen period. Prior to the Guzuku period, the inhabitants of Ryukyu and Amami led a primitive lifestyle centered on fishing, hunting, and gathering. At a later point, as their lifestyle shifted to cultivation, we observed the emergence of agricultural villages populated by people related by blood or marriage. During this time, we find the emergence of a leading class known as Aji or lords in every village, and it is with the Aji that we see the first small single enclosures named Guzuku that mark the sphere of their political power. The Guzuku resembled the walled fortified castles built with stone that were developed in Japan during the Warring States period, and can be categorized into two groups, either as small single enclosure structures or as large multiple enclosure structures. As liege lords appeared in the 13th century, they built larger with multiple enclosures Guzuku and began to absorb smaller neighbors to consolidate their power. 5 Guzuku ruins are currently registered as UNESCO sites: Nachikin, Zakimi, Katsuden, Nagasusuku, and Shuri. During the struggle of the various Aji, the Ryukyu split into several domains, with Okinawa and its nearest islands divided into 3 regions in the mid-14th century. Kunigami, with its chief lords based on Sonhoku Castle, today's Najikin Castle, in the north; Nakagami, with its chief lords in Shuzan, today's Urusoe, in the central area; and Shimajiri, with its chief lords at Shimajiri Osatu Sanan in the south. Known as Three Mountains and Three Kingdom Mountains, they competed for supremacy. During this period, trade still grew between the domains and goods circulated through the regions more widely, allowing the islands to develop a general greater Ryukyu culture, which encompassed the 2 separate cultural spheres that had long existed in the archipelago, namely the northern Ryukyu culture shaped by both Jomon and Yayoi cultural influences, and the southern Ryukyu culture, with its links to the societies of Polynesia, the Southeast Asian island groups, and Taiwan. As the kingdom's power rested in the domains of Shuzan, Okuzan, and Nanzan, Yang Zai chose to present his imperial proclamation to the most powerful one, Shuzan. Shortly after receiving the decree, King Sato dispatched his younger brother Taiki to China as his tribute envoy. Diplomatic relations with China would thus start in 1372, when envoys of King Sato of Shuzan sent tribute to the Ming court in Yingtan. The Ryukyu Boyo is one of Okinawa's traditional performing arts, believed to have developed between the 14th and 15th centuries, and was performed to greet the Chinese emissaries at welcoming banquets. The music and poetry of the Ryukyan are unique and do not manifest many clearly identifiable Chinese or Japanese stylistic elements. The poetic structure of the classical Ryukyan song or poetry form is the ryuka, which consists of the combination of 8 and 6 syllables. The basic element of their songs has consisted of the use of human voice accompanied by the 3-stringed lute sanshin that would be later introduced in Japan, the shamisen. As the tribute legations grew, Emperor Ongwu started to limit how often a country could send legations to the court. But while most sought restriction schedules imposed on them, the Ryukyu were excused of the limiting schedules and were in fact designated as having no specific legation schedule. Another important note on the preferential treatment to the Ryukyu regards the grant of tribute ships. Although China provided tribute ships to all its client states to maintain a degree of control over the tributary system, just between 1368 and 1424, China granted at least 30 ocean-going ships from the fleets attached to the coastal military fortifications to the Ryukyu, and with the ships were also personnel such as navigators. The Ming tributary system also controlled and limited the ports of entry and trading posts for tribute legations, with each nation being assigned its own designated location for both. Yet, the Ryukyu, who had a compound built for their envoys and legations, with their port of entry at Guangzhou, frequently arrived instead at Fuzhou to the north or at Ningbo or Ruyan in the Zhejiang province. After 1383, China introduced sea-crossing permits that verified if the ships were legitimate tribute vessels. Every time a new emperor ascended to the throne, new papers were required and tribute records were wiped out. However, the Ryukyu were exempted from these rules, as in their case the royal government had the authority to issue an off-seal verification license that worked as a sea-crossing permit. But why the clear preferential status? The preferential status of the Ryukyu is related to the continuous pirates attacks along China's coast. The emperor viewed the issue as Japan's responsibility to control, yet Japan's response to China envoys was dismissive, and its entry into the tributary system would be much later. China's preferential treatment towards the Ryukyu served as a countermeasure against the maritime powers, especially of Japan pirates. The Ryukyu also served as middleman between China and Japan, as well as it was its biggest provider of sulfur and horses, two things highly important to the Ming court, who still dealt with the remnants of the Yuan dynasty and its allies. In 1406, Shisho and Hashi seized control of Shuzan, later subduing Sanhoku in 1416 and Sanan or Nanzan in 1429, establishing a unified island. Theirs would be the first Zhou dynasty and mark the creation of the Ryukyu kingdom. By the later half of the 15th century, the third king of the second Zhou dynasty summoned all Aji to live below the Shuri castle. Their domains would be administered by representatives of the lords called Aji Uchi or Aji agents. With the Aji away from their domains, the previously independent fiefdoms came under the complete control of the Shuri royal government, signaling the end of the Gosuku period. The unification of the Ryukyu under one kingdom would increase trade as the Ryukyans broadened their maritime commerce, whilst mediating connection with mainland Japan, China, the Korean peninsula, and Southeast Asia. The relationship between Korea and the Ryukyu was friendly and dated to 1389. Their friendship continued even after the Goryeo dynasty fell in 1392, as their relationship consisted in exchanges where the Ryukyu returned people that had either been captured by pirates or rescued while adrift at sea, and the Korean king sent gifts of thanks in return. The emphasis for both Ryukyu and Korea was on developing a mutual rewarding relationship of proper formality and good neighborliness, rather than becoming economic trading partners. Regarding religion, the women had an important role in Ryukyu society as the spiritual protectors. The women prayed for the safety of the journeys and their safe return home. There are many songs they composed that tell of their respect for the gods and their earnest prayers. Women were believed to have spiritual powers that protected men, referred to as onarigami belief. In Shuriju Castle, for example, there are a number of sacred places where only the women prayed, not the king. Interestingly, there are no idols to represent the gods, as nature itself was considered a place for praying. After the 15th century, Naha became a center of trade. Dependent on the seasonal winds, the merchants spent considerable amounts of time waiting to return home. It can thus be assumed that residential districts emerged, leading, for example, to the establishment of Kumano shrines by Japanese, who spent their lives at sea. It is also believed that Buddhism arrived at the kingdom through Japanese monks. believed to have been brought in by the monk Zenkan during the Kanjun era. And with it, Japanese culture and literature were introduced to Ryukyu society. The Ryukyu participation in overseas trade reached its peak from the end of the 14th century to the mid-16th century. These interactions exposed the Ryukyu to not only politico-economic stimuli but also culturally, as they mixed elements from different cultural sources, resulting in the formation of a unique cultural style, evident for example with the construction of guzukus. Within the same system, these islanders had a privileged position. Compared to other tribute partners being allowed for certain periods to send missions to China more frequently, they provided as a trade intermediary a row of territories with coveted Chinese goods, a prosperous and flourishing venture for around 2 centuries. Then in 1609, Kabayama Izataka invaded the kingdom with more than 3,000 men. Quickly defeated, the kingdom became under control of the Tokugawa shogun's Bakuhan administrative system. It was treated as a foreign land ruled by Satsuma with the backing of the shogun. With the subsequent takeover by the Shimazu clan of Satsuma, the Ryukyu kingdom was forced to cede territory, then limited to Okinawa and Sakishima island groups. The Daito group was officially annexed by Japan only in 1885, and the Senkaku group, near Taiwan, was part of the territory ceded to Japan by China after the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. Thus, neither of these islands group was ever part of the Ryukyu kingdom. Recognizing China's role as a potential safeguard, the kingdom maintained a certain distance from the Bakufu so it could preserve itself as an independent nation. And Satsuma's policy of allowing the kingdom to retain its client status with China would prove useful to the Ryukyu. The kingdom deliberately intensified the degree to which it signified and increased its commitment to the diplomatic protocols and tribute exchanges required of a client of the powerful Chinese Empire. In this way, the Ryukyu kingdom established a subtle safeguard and built a resistance that slowed its extinction by the overweening power and cultural influence of Satsuma and the Bakufu. The Ryukyu thus became a buffer zone between Japan and China, creating a unique identity that was neither completely Chinese nor completely Japanese. The unification of Japan by Toyotomi Hideyoshi strongly affected the Ryukyu. The invasion of Korea had impact in the battle between Japan and China, leading the Ryukyu to manage a particularly difficult diplomacy with China and Japan, juggling their alliance with Ming whilst maintaining relations with Satsuma and Toyotomi Japan. With the death of Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu became the ruler of Japan and started negotiations with Ming China, using various channels of communication, including the Ryukyu. The Ryukyu reluctance in helping the negotiations due to what it could signify to the Ryukyu was seen by Japan as stubbornness, and the Tokugawa shogunate would eventually approve the dispatchment of troops by Satsuma. This would lead to the incorporation of the Ryukyu under the rule of Satsuma and consequently the Tokugawa shogunate. With the invasion, the Ryukyu kingdom was forced to manage its own diplomacy under the restrictions imposed by Satsuma and the Tokugawa shogunate, later becoming known as the concealment policy of the relationship with Japan. With the death of Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1616, the diplomatic policy of the shogunate abandoned the restoration of relations between Japan and Ming China, and gradually restricted the maritime trade. Satsuma's attitude towards the Ryukyu also changed, considering them a foreign country, and in 1634, the title Kokoshi was a tribute to the king of Shuzan and regarded as official by Satsuma. In the late 17th century, the Ryukyu elite were expected to study calligraphy and poetry, music, and achieve other cultural accomplishments. Drama, music, and the applied arts developed among the ruling class, centered on the castle at the kingdom's capital at Shuri, now part of Naha. These art forms did not develop according to the preferences and tastes of individual artists and patrons. Rather, they were supervised and directed by the royal government. The local elite was responsible for cultivating the performing traditional arts, and all the dancers were men. Initially a form of prayer to the gods, dance evolved into folk and court performances. In the early 18th century, Tamagosuku Shokun was appointed as dance magistrate, and his mission was to entertain Chinese envoys sent by the Chinese emperor to crown the new Ryukyu king. Based on Okinawa's indigenous performing arts and fables, and with inspiration from performing arts in mainland Japan and Chinese theater, Kumiodori was created. The Kumiodori, or ensemble dance, consists of the theatrical expression and arrangement of short songs handed down through generations and would become part of UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2010. Its content can usually be divided into two categories: mundane topics such as romance, coming of age, or violent revenge killings. Okinawa dance can be divided into four styles: Koten Boyo, classical dance, which was performed in the court; the Zo Udoi, or mixed dance, that depicts mundane experiences and emerged on the later half of the 18th century; the Soseka Boyo, creative dance, which is choreographed by modern dancers; and Mizuko Boyo, or folk dance. With the end of the Ryukyu Kingdom in 1879, members of the elite that lost their positions as government officials ended taking jobs as entertainers, writing Okinawa dramas and folk songs. Another excellent representative of Okinawan arts and crafts is lacquerware. With a climate excellent for its production, it was produced solely under government control and used as gifts on diplomatic missions. The Ryukyu's privileged position with China would eventually decline due to multiple combined factors, such as the improvements of relations between China and Japan, who started to act regarding the pirating menace and joined the tributary system, as well as due to other issues that arose from the reputation the Ryukyu gained due to the unruly behavior caused by some of its legation's members. The punishment for the repeated scandals surrounding the Ryukyuans took the form of the Chinese limiting them to one tribute mission every 2 years, restricting their meal allowance to cover a maximum of 150 people, and forbidding the inclusion, with the king's tribute and related goods, of private merchandise, the disposition of which had proved the cause of so many problems. These restrictions would be further increased as frequent missions presented a considerable economic burden, and it became a matter of political importance to reduce the burden these legations put on the locals they passed through as they made their way to the capital. Another important aspect would be the investment the Ming court did in strengthening its defenses and fortifying the Great Wall, which led to the expenditure of vast sums from the national treasury. This would strain expenditures in other areas such as the coastal defense system, and consequently the shipbuilding and the grant of ships to the Ryukyu. During the reign of King Shosei, the shipbuilding industry shifted to Ryukyu itself, and Ryukyuan-built hulls came to be used in the tribute trade. The policy of extreme favoritism towards Ryukyu as seen under Emperors Hongu and Yongle faded under the straitened public finances and budgetary austerities of the Ming government. As the Shimazu clan was charged by the shogunate to resolve the illegal shipping, Shohan strengthened his ties with the resident Chinese representatives that oversaw Ryukyu's international trade. By the late 16th century, the Ming dynasty declining power allowed the Chinese to start sailing abroad again. Portugal and Spain began entering Asia, and Ryukyu's golden age of maritime trade came to a close. Since then, the Ryukyuan ships sailed only to China and Japan. The arrival of European merchants also led the Ryukyu to lose their role as trade intermediaries. The weakening of their strategic power made them more vulnerable to outside attacks and attempts by their rivals to take them over. And whilst the Japanese traders increased, the Ming dynasty power decreased, and with it the protection over the Ryukyu. In time, the extensive trade network broke down, and the island's kingdom became isolated. Thereafter, with more and more growing influence of Japanese mainland until 1879, when Okinawa and the surrounding smaller islands, with their unique cultural background, were annexed as Japanese territory. In 1879, the Meiji government pressured the last Ryukyu king to surrender, marking the end of the Ryukyu kingdom with its seat at Shurijo. As Japanese ambition rose and the military conflict expanded throughout East Asia and the Pacific in the mid-1930s, so did the effort in promoting loyalty, patriotism, and national unity. Viewed by policymakers as nothing more than dialects of Japanese, the Ryukyuan languages were prohibited and the Japanese language cohesively imposed. with active measures to suppress the Ryukyu Islanders and conform them to the nationalistic model of Japanese language and culture. By 1939, the suppression of Ryukyuan had been extended well beyond the classroom. A law was passed requiring the use of standard Japanese in all government offices and institutions. Customers who used Ryukyuan in these places would be denied service, and any employees who spoke Ryukyuan were fined. As the war progressed towards its inevitable catastrophe, the situation only got worse for the Ryukyuans. The Ryukyu are comprised of several indigenous language groups with distinct cultural traits and are not recognized by the Japanese government as indigenous people. Although Japan adopted the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, it does not recognize the unconditional right to self-determination and has not ratified the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention. While many classify Japanese and Ryukyuan to be distinctive languages, many Japanese scholars classify Ryukyuan as a dialect of Japanese. According to Dubinsky et al., from a linguistic perspective, calling Ryukyuan and Japanese dialects of the same language would be no different from calling English, German, and Icelandic dialects of the same language. As according to results employing the lexicostatistics method, the percentage of cognates between the Lutheran languages and Tokyo Japanese is lower than those between German and English. Three major events have been responsible for the loss of vast amount of documentation and original artifacts. The Satsuma invasion of 1609, the Kanto earthquake of 1923, and the Battle of Okinawa in 1945 that would destroy most of its cities, and with it, much of the important historiographic documentation and castles, which would hinder the cultural heritage and identity of the Ryukyus. Shurijo Castle, for example, served as a Japanese headquarters during the Pacific War and was consequently bombed. Its ruins would become the University of the Ryukyu, and only when the university moved to a new campus did the project to rebuild the castle begin, with its completion in February 2019. Only a few records written in Chinese and/or Ryukyuan have survived. These records are continuously studied by various scholars. The lack of core resources has prompted scholars to find new approaches and start initiatives to reenact Ryukyuan cultural identity in Okinawa. Ryukyuans were a well-known seafaring people amongst the many others with whom they have traded with throughout 16th century Asia. This fact is widely testified by a manifold of contemporary Portuguese and Spanish reports in letters and historiographic records mentioning the strategic location of the Ryukyu Islands, describing its inhabitants or enunciating sorts of commodities exchanged. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you have enjoyed the video, as it helps the growth of this channel. And do let me know in the comments your thoughts. Had you heard of the Ryukyu? As Japan is still not recognizing the Ryukyu as an indigenous group, do you know of other indigenous groups in the same situation? And what other indigenous groups do you know and feel are not often mentioned? Stay safe.